Seminar of this term with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm really delighted to welcome back Dorothy Byrne. She spoke to us at the start of this academic year in October, in what seems a lifetime ago, about diversity. And her quote at the time, if you get diversity in your newsroom wrong, you will literally get the newsroom wrong. You will get the news wrong, has become ever more relevant as the year has progressed. She's currently with us as a visiting fellow, but she was also head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 till very recently, and is still editor at large. She has just completed a green survey of how the channel can do its programming in a more environmentally friendly way. And she is working on several strategic issues with them that I'll leave her to talk to you about. As normal, this session is on the record. Dorothy will speak for a while, and then I'm happy to take questions. Please type them into the chat box and I'll put them to her. Thank you. Dorothy, welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the honour of being a visiting fellow, even if I can't visit, which is very sad. I'll embark. So, UK journalists have embarked on a major critique of the performance of politicians and scientists in this pandemic, and rightly so. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost. Our economy has slumped, and there are fears that the future of a whole generation has been blighted. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't examine the advice given and the decisions made. But it's only fair that we should also start to critique ourselves. I believe that dogged investigation by journalists contributed to saving lives in this pandemic. But how, overall, have we performed in our coverage of COVID-19? Where did we get it right? And where perhaps did we make some of the same mistakes of which we accuse politicians and scientists? This seminar is based on my professional opinion and experience in covering the pandemic, on off-the-record conversations with some of broadcasting's most senior political and specialist journalists, on discussion with journalists on specialist publications, and on discussion with scientists we have relied on and used. This is not the journalistic equivalent of an early inquiry, but the interviews that I have conducted raise some challenging issues which I hope others in this august institution will take forward in academic research. I am, as editor-at-large at Channel 4, particularly interested in public service broadcasters. I've anonymised almost all my interviews because I wanted journalists to be honest about where they found covering this story difficult. And those I spoke to admitted they had wrestled at times with how to do their jobs. That's only to be expected. This pandemic is without precedent in our professional lives. I think some of what they told me is important in informing our journalism going forward. Here are some of my questions. Did we journalists give sufficient coverage to COVID-19 in February following the January the 30th World Health Organization announcement of a pandemic? Richard Horton of The Lancet is sure we did not, and a senior television editor told me he had looked back at his programme's coverage during February and in hindsight wondered why on some days the coming pandemic was not even in the headlines. Another senior editor said, "To be honest, I don't think it was taken seriously until Lombardy, everyone's favourite middle-class destination." A specialist journalist admitted they hadn't believed the dire warnings. How did we handle the completely new experience for journalists in a democracy of our primary task being to inform the public of a government message in a national emergency in order to save lives? As one editor put it, democracy shut down. We were keen to pass on the government's potentially life-saving message, but did the political journalists leading the coverage have sufficient scientific knowledge and understanding to interpret that message? Some have told me that looking back, they realised they should have asked more questions about the much repeated statement that politicians were following the science. As Horton put it, I would have asked, Which scientists? A specialist journalist told me, science isn't one thing. Science is about uncertainty and reducing uncertainty. People expected science to know what it doesn't know. A program editor confirmed that view. They were trying to put a certainty where it didn't exist. Another said, science doesn't give you actionable policy. And one of the leading experts sought by all in this pandemic told me, there is no such thing as a single opinion. Everyone is learning. Journalists like definitive facts from experts, but he added, they would ask me, what will happen? I just want to improve understanding. So how did we cope with this story when at its heart was complex science, and like politicians, most of us have arts and politics educations? Angela Merkel was a brilliant student of mathematics. Her doctorate was in quantum chemistry. How many of us even know what that is? In this pandemic, she read key scientific papers herself. Boris Johnson has a degree in classics. He told the Commons Liaison Committee he had not actually read the scientific papers. He has since said he has read scientific papers. Almost none of our leading politicians has a scientific background. Health Secretary Matt Hancock has a degree in politics, philosophy and economics, PPE, from Oxford. Rishi Sunak, another Oxford PPE bloke. Guess what Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodd studied? PPE at Oxford. And Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth studied politics and philosophy, the P's without the E. On the Labour side, Keir Starmer's degree is in law. And what of the key advisors? Dominic Cummings studied ancient and modern history. Handy in a 2020 pandemic. Baroness Dido Harding put in charge of track and trace. Guess what? PPE at Oxford. There was a huge shortage of PPE equipment in hospitals and care homes in this crisis, but no shortage of PPEs among those dealing with the crisis. Which PPE would our health and care workers rather have had? But hang on, Robert Peston also studied PPE at Oxford. He likes a long question at a press conference, does Robert, but he is also the recipient of one of pandemic's cringe-making moments when he asked a very long question about testing, and Professor Jonathan Van Dam replied, I am afraid, sir, you are very wrong. Laura Kunsberg and Gary Gibbon both studied history. The academic backgrounds of political journalists are uncannily similar to those of politicians. Let's be frank, in a medical emergency, you wouldn't call on a single one of them. However, when I talked to specialist journalists and scientists, they said that they thought political journalists got up to speed remarkably well in the circumstances. Global health expert Michael Head told me there was an anxiety to get the story right. Journalists were very conscious of their public service role. But it was not just our profession's lack of scientific knowledge which hampered us. We often didn't understand data. Experts complain our profession regularly mixed up the denominator. If you don't understand what that means, maybe you are part of the problem. Experts said that 30% of people with COVID may test negative. That was reported wrongly as 30% of negative tests being wrong. The risk of dying of COVID was also confused. One way of looking at the problem is to ask what your chance of dying is. The other is to ask, what is your chance of getting it and then dying? Two quite different things, but they were sometimes confused. The conduct of the daily press conference is an issue which everyone raised. On the one hand, journalists were relieved that politicians were putting themselves up to lengthy scrutiny daily after a long period before the pandemic in which many leading politicians refused to do anything but short interviews or photo opportunities. There is a widespread view that broadcasters sometimes sent the wrong journalists to press conferences. The heavyweight political editors pushed out the less well-known health stalwarts. One health correspondent said, if you're a health specialist, there are not normally many people splashing in your paddling pool. All of a sudden, health is the only game in town. A scientist said to me that the flashy political correspondent would be sent, who understood very little about the scientific facts on days when the key points were about detailed scientific and data issues, so the key questions were not asked. A number of television journalists complained to me that specialist correspondents were passed over for attendance in favour of well-known political editors who didn't have the in-depth knowledge needed. The story of COVID-19 is a health story, a science story, a data story, and a political story. I think there is a good case made that science and health correspondents should have been sent to press conferences more often and political editors less. We have rarely seen the BBC science editor at one of these conferences. One senior programme editor said to me, "This was a science story, so why was it being covered by political journalists with their long-winded, pointless questions who seemed interested only in getting something for the next bulletin?" A specialist TV journalist told me, "It's brilliant when the specialists are asking the questions at the press conference, but if the Prime Minister is up, the news desk doesn't want the science person doing it." Specialist correspondents said they understood that political editors were the stars, but one said that the big names were sometimes bamboozled, as he put it, because of their lack of scientific understanding when a politician was dodging a hard question. This view was widespread among those I talked to. A specialist journalist who didn't attend the press conferences told me, "Watching the press conferences, I would think, those are not the questions I would ask." I don't think that I'm being partial when I say that what I liked about Channel 4 News' coverage was the increasing weight was given to the health editor, Victoria MacDonald. Her relationship with the political editor, Gary Gibbon, felt more like a partnership, and ultimately that is what was needed. Horton told me that he felt greater partnership was essential between specialists and the political journalists, or as another journalist put it to me, "This isn't a story for going solo." We also don't have nearly enough journalists who are really confident with data, a point I believe that Dominic Cummings has made. Tim Harford's brilliant Radio 4 programme, More or Less, has been a shining jewel in this crisis. The Science Media Centre did excellent work organising detailed background briefings and encouraging scientists to speak on television. I truly admire their work. But it was really depressing to see that nearly all the experts at Downing Street briefings and in general were white men. TV needs to improve its diversity, but whichever institutions control who rises up in the science and public health spheres should be utterly ashamed of themselves. The government must be embarrassed and should demand a detailed programme of action which should be made public. When you think that we discovered people from BAME backgrounds in our health services were at so much greater risk, and when you saw all those white blokes standing next to politicians, you felt you didn't need to be a detective inspector to know you were onto something. In lockdown, some of my liberal friends have been embarrassed to admit they just wanted to leave reality and that they started watching Midsummer Murders. They apologised and said that they knew it was completely unrepresentative as a depiction of UK society. Okay, in Midsummer Murders, virtually everyone, dead or alive, is white, but at least women are a major feature. Midsummer Murders is in fact more representative of modern Britain than have been the briefings and appearances of experts on TV. And I should say that I know Channel 4 News has gone out of its way to find female experts. Some scientists said to me that at first they appreciated being given the opportunity to inform the public directly through in-depth interviews. But as the story became more political, they stopped doing interviews because they felt they were being drawn into political rows. Some also felt that journalists took an "any expert will do" attitude and asked experts questions way beyond their own field of expertise. So some of the experts felt pressurized into answering questions beyond their ken, which does not help public trust and understanding at all. One expert told me, Just because a scientist says something, you don't have to give it much credit. There is a criticism that both scientists and journalists on some occasion gave attention and significance to scientific studies that were rushed out and later turned out not to be correct, like the study which indicated those who had just recovered from COVID could be reinfected. Scientists also began to realize there would be an inquiry at some point, and they didn't want to end up being criticized. I talked to one of the leading quoted experts, and I think it's worth hearing what he had to say. It's been so overwhelming from my perspective. I'm trying to learn how to do it better in future. I have never worked so hard in my life. It was a surprising experience for him, he said. I used to be really pleased if I got an offer to be on TV. Now I have to turn stuff down. He said he felt needed, empowered, and had a great sense of satisfaction. He was doing good. There has been an overwhelming demand for help, explanation, and expert opinion, he said. On the whole, he felt well treated, but he said it was almost frightening, the notice that we so-called experts received. The mere pronouncements of scientists became the story. It was empowering and frightening. One had to be so careful. Journalists really tried to understand and do good, accurate reporting. However, he was one of the experts I talked to who said journalists often didn't understand the basics of statistics. Like the other experts, he complained he would be asked to opine on matters way outside his actual expertise. They expect you to be an expert on everything. R, epidemiology, face masks, the difference between 1 meter and 2 meters. I'm afraid to say that he told me that on occasion he would be pre-interviewed by researchers who would assure him he would not be asked on air about issues beyond his expertise, and then he would be asked about those very issues live on air. He told me one of the problems has been that the modelers have shut down. They have gone into bunker mode. I don't blame them. I was head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 when the extent of the threat to health became absolutely clear. That was a very difficult time. Keeping the news going technically while protecting staff and interviewees was a giant achievement by all. As Michael Jeremy, head of ITV News, says, there was a time in March when we all wondered if we would stay on air. The public was desperate for information. In the early days on Channel 4 News, figures often doubled, and some nights the percentage of young viewers was up 70%. Other broadcasters saw similar increases. At Channel 4, we are known for our investigations, but in the early days, the priority was trying to relay information with clarity and in as much detail as possible. We extended our news programs by an hour on several nights. Once lockdown was ordered, the need for practical information was paramount, and we commissioned a large number of very fast turnaround programs. Can our supermarket cope? What's it like to catch coronavirus? How do I clean my house? How do I cope with the psychological effects of lockdown? How long will lockdown last? The channel launched a stay-at-home campaign, putting a bug with that hashtag on all programs and broadcasting humorous promos urging people to sit on their arses. This was an extraordinary moment as the channel was aligning 100% with a government message. One cannot understate how unusual that is. The channel commissioned a raft of other programs encouraging people to stay at home. Jamie Oliver, Cooking in Lockdown, Kirsty Allsop, Crafting in Lockdown, Grayson Perry, Helping the Nation Create Art at Home. As a public service broadcaster, we threw our weight behind the government's campaign to keep the nation indoors. Levels of public trust in our COVID coverage, high in normal times, rose to 83%, according to the regulator Ofcom. It was the same for BBC and ITV, with Sky just slightly behind. Prior to this pandemic, some had said that mainstream broadcasters were no longer relevant. Politicians didn't need to appear on them, and the BBC could even be forced to become a subscription service. In this emergency, we were vital. Without highly trusted and regulated public service television broadcasters, it's hard to see that the UK would have had such overwhelming support for lockdown. Of course, if one day it turns out we didn't need lockdown, we will all have eggs on our faces. How did we then cope when we started to realise that there were serious problems emerging across the country with PPE and in care homes, resulting in many deaths about which we were not being informed through official channels? Our responsibility was the greater because the Labour Party was not a significant presence in the first weeks of the crisis. As the gravity of the problems became clear, some television journalists felt in a difficult position. One editor told me, "Some felt we all had to be part of the public health messaging, and that is part of the role, but they have never recovered their footing. The government was convinced from private polling that people didn't like seeing journalists challenging at press conferences. So some felt we should all be part of the national effort." Another said, "The difficulty is lives are being lost. It puts pressure on journalists to communicate a public message to the country, so you're slow to move into full accountability." But another felt more confident and says, "We aim to get the balance between conveying public health messages and interrogating government policy." Here, journalists are rightly proud that it was they who exposed what was really going on in hospitals and care homes up and down the country, thereby helping to bring a change in policy and practice. ITV head of news, Michael Jeremy, told me, "The process of holding government to account quite rapidly changed policy. It was here that health correspondents and editors came into their own." A political editor was honest with me about how handy his contact book of political figures was in a pandemic. He said, "The contacts you know are of no use to you in this story." A political correspondent sang the praises to me of a group he called unshowy, but who have become stars in this crisis. In contrast, most health specialists had years of experience and contacts, and they now use them to great effect. They work day after day with health and care professionals to reveal the truth. We should, as journalists, pay tribute to the people who put their careers on the line to reveal what was happening. Remember that threats were made to anyone who talked to journalists, and they were told that they could face disciplinary action. And social media proved vital. As one health editor told me, "The health service is full of people who wouldn't normally talk, especially about something like PPE. But we could contact these people on social media, the porters and nursing assistants, people way down the food chain who work for private companies who would never normally talk. Their fear of the virus overtook their fear of job loss." Since Horton was critical of journalists' appreciation in February of the impending catastrophe, I shall quote what he told me about what we did later on. "I think journalists have done a fantastic job of forensically holding the government to account. Some newspapers have given superlative detailed coverage. And I must say myself that I really admired some of the investigations conservative supporting papers like the Mail and the Telegraph carried out." Part of the way in which health specialists have come into their own has been the important role played by the Health Service Journal. It's worth stepping aside for a moment to examine a very different model of reporting. HSJ is required reading for anyone interested in the non-clinical side of the NHS and has about 30,000 readers across government, the NHS, pharmaceutical companies, and those supplying technology and expertise to the NHS. But when this pandemic began, they took down their payroll wall so anyone can read it, and I really recommend it. The magazine has a dozen experts, including a patient safety correspondent and 2 technology correspondents. Each journalist also takes responsibility for a different part of the country. Editor Alistair McClellan is rightly proud of the role they played in breaking stories, including revelations about problems with the app and testing. We had the expertise and the resource, he said. DHSAJ's journalists briefed the lobby at key moments in this story. What's really interesting about their model is they also have a 12-strong research team in India which has been analysing data throughout. The result of that work is yet to come, and I'm sure it will be of great importance. So what can we learn for how we should conduct our journalism going forward? Of course, we need more science graduates in journalism. The television industry must work with universities in imaginative ways in encouraging top science graduates to enter our field. But everyone should be made to do maybe a half-day training in some basic concepts about science. Journalists need to learn they can't always have a definitive answer. As one expert told me, everyone in SAGE is disagreeing and cautious and disputing. Journalists have got to learn to cope with the concept of uncertainty. This error was made in some of the terrible reporting of MMR, when some journalists totally misunderstood the significance of scientists saying that nothing is risk-free. COVID-19 was a new virus, and we were asking experts to give firm views when the experts themselves were learning every day. As Alistair McClellan put it, we're all on a learning curve, even the expert journalists and the very best scientists in the world. However, some of the errors were caused by lack of understanding of basic statistics. Should every broadcaster run a course for its journalists in statistics? I think so. In my career, I've often been astounded by basic errors made in reporting something as obvious as percentages in a survey. As one of the experts I consulted said, you don't need a degree in statistics, you need a critical mind. COVID-19 has meant politicians, scientists, other experts and journalists have each in their own way had to go on a massive learning journey, and we have inevitably all made mistakes. One of the leading experts I talked to, quoted everywhere in the media, told me, everyone is learning. And McClellan says, we're all becoming more informed about the true nature of science. Scientists work in a complicated and nuanced world. The science doesn't tell you what to do. It is not a set of instructions. But we need to be clear that ultimately it's not journalists or scientists or other experts who run this country. It's politicians. We shouldn't judge them unfairly. We should take into account that they were guided by advice which might have been flawed. Sadly, key decision makers didn't have the sort of background Angela Merkel had, which might have helped them to question that advice better. A couple of weeks ago, Channel 4 Dispatches broadcast the first major television investigation into the government's handling of COVID-19. Its findings were disturbing, and it was also disappointing that no government spokesperson would appear in it. There has been some brilliant investigation across the media in this crisis, literally life-saving, and it's the duty of television to continue to investigate because so many lives have been lost and so many jobs have and will be lost. We must do this fairly, aware that this pandemic is an event without precedent in our lifetimes, so we can't expect policy to be perfectly right all the time. But we must not be afraid to investigate so that the suffering of all and the deaths of so many were not utterly wasted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. It was a magisterial talk, and I asked you to speak about public trust in dangerous times, which you absolutely did. And you also highlighted what the dangers are. They're the dangers from the virus, they're the dangers from a loss of trust, they're the dangers of getting bad information out there, and crucially of not being able to effectively hold power to account because we lack the skills to do so. Can I ask you, it was very striking the way you described how Channel 4 and other national broadcasters aligned with the government messaging over lockdown and stay at home. And you touched on this lightly. You said if it turns out that we were wrong to lock down, we'll be left up with egg on our faces. But do you think there is a kind of fundamental, more profound change in the relationship and the way you're seen by the public? Does that whole kind of alignment with the messaging make the public feel that you're more part of the kind of government machinery, or do you think it'll go back to normal?
I don't think. I think that would, in a democracy, disturb the public.
Yeah.
And I think that actually over time, what they have seen is that we have both cared about public safety and been critical. So they have seen both things. But I'm in no doubt that it was so extraordinary that broadcasters were saying stay at home, that I really think that will have had a major effect on the fact that the people of the UK abided on the whole by the rules so closely.
Everyone seems very surprised by that, how effective the lockdown was in
Well, maybe also we underestimate how nice British people are. Actually, the longer I'm a journalist, the less I go along with the idea that British people are not good. I mean, look at the extraordinary thing which happened yesterday when everybody signed the petition to help young children living in impoverished circumstances. And in my area, I mean, I've written about this, all the people who came round to my house, and because I'm older, and when this started, I was on a drug which put me at risk, and lots of people who I didn't even know came round and offered to do my shopping and everything. So I think, we've discovered some very good things about ourselves in this country.
Thank you. And if I go back to the point again, which you made absolutely correctly about the tension and the cooperation between health specialists and political correspondents. And you mentioned a very specific thing at Channel 4 News where Victoria MacDonald, the health correspondent, partnered essentially with Gary Gibbon.
Yes.
How did that come about? Was that the two of them going to their editor and saying, look, we need to work together? Was it the editor saying work together?
I'm at large, so I wasn't there. But I think what I saw was that Gary started off, and then more and more you saw Victoria, and then more and more on the news when some other news programs had their political editors explaining what was happening. We had Victoria explaining what was happening, and for me that really worked well as a viewer, because I felt that she understood both medical matters but also how health systems worked. I mean, one of the experts said to me that when there was a lot of discussion about Germany versus the UK, and he said, journalists were talking about that and they had no understanding of how the German health system worked.
Yeah. I mean, on that point of expertise, we're just going to go to the questions in the chat room. And this, starting with Peter Burke, who says he agrees entirely about the importance of expertise. And do you feel that the search for balance sometimes leads to the broadcast of vox pops that overvalue the views of non-experts? And should the media broadcasters be better at distinguish between fact, speculation, opinion, and hypothesis? And Julia Derbyshire kind of adds to that, saying balance was one of the problems with MMR reporting. Balance is clearly needed.
Oh yeah, I mean,
certain.
Absolutely. Some broadcasters, you know, I couldn't believe it that they would have Andrew Wakefield on. I mean, the man was struck off, partly because of some Channel 4 journalism. You know, yeah, balance is, you can't balance stupidity with sense. I think actually we haven't had that many vox pops in this pandemic, and some of them were more people telling you about their experiences rather than what I think we all probably hate, which is, you know, you go out in a city and there's a government policy and you have to find two people who are for it and two people who are against it.
As a result of the coronavirus, journalists learned something new.
I'm sorry, can we mute the microphones?
All right, yeah. So yeah, those are pointless vox pops, but I think it was incredibly important to hear the voices of the people in this pandemic, and we made several, you know, we made a program that was just about what it was like to be an elderly person at home, and almost because we couldn't meet each other in the street, you actually met people through TV often. And then talking about speculation, well, you see, I think that one thing that went wrong was that people thought there's speculation over there and then there's scientific certainty over here, and actually there some, you know, science, as I say, is not about certainty, and you know, some of it is a bit speculative, and you know, the experts I talked to, as I mentioned, said that, you know, a small report would come out, you know, in somewhere, and all the journalists would leap on it, but it was actually a pretty small study. And sometimes it turned out that when these studies were peer reviewed, they didn't stand up. You know, we were all desperate for new medical information. And, you know, I think maybe we got some as a group, you know, because it's not about getting any particular person. You know, as a group, do we need to just look a bit more at how big was that study? And certainly in my career, that has been a major feature for me, that people will say they've got a really good story and, you know, some amazing, you know, thing that they can reveal, that, you know, shoe polish kills children or something, and you think, gosh, that's surprising. And then you ask how many people were in that study, and it was like 2 children, and they slipped on a tin of shoe polish or something, you know. So I think we need to have much greater understanding of the difference between a good medical study and a very limited medical study. And now you've turned yourself off.
I've turned myself off. It's interesting the role the Lancet has played in both the good and the bad of this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, they had an issue, and then they also did some very good things. And I think, you know, that's why I say this was a huge learning curve, and it's inevitable that everybody involved will have made mistakes.
And speaking of mistakes, question from Mehdi Askaria about the Neil Ferguson episode. So this is the scientific advice on the stage committee, the kind of key person behind the modelling, behind the pandemic, response to the pandemic, who then resigned from the committee because he was discovered, his lover was discovered to have broken lockdown by visiting him.
Yes, yes.
What do you think of that? I mean, in terms of what it did, you know, in terms of reporting and what it did to the public debate at the time?
Well, I can't 100% remember, but if we covered it on Channel 4 News, we didn't give it that much coverage. I have said at one of these seminars before, I was absolutely astonished that Radio 4 led on that story on the day that their second story was, we had the highest number of deaths in Europe. And the third story was that Donald Trump had announced that he planned to shut his COVID task force. For me, story number 2 was of incredible importance. And I've never actually met Neil Ferguson or his lover. So I think people overdid that story. What a number of journalists, of course, pointed out to me was that on the day of the Dominic Cummings story, I think that was something like number 4 on BBC News at 10. So, you know, I think stories of hypocrisy when other people are obeying the rules, yeah, they get to the public. They're real stories, but the most real story is deaths, illness, and economic destruction.
Thank you. You very eloquently kind of listed the role of Oxford's PPE degree in educating several cabinet ministers, and the question from Roxy McRae, sorry, when it comes to the world we're entering now, building from the ground up in new ways of working, how effective are the journalists and politicians who are educated at Oxford in these subjects? I mean, are they basically removed from the general public's realities? And does the lack of diversity in media and politics, should that be valued as highly, you know, people's real life experience, do you think that should be valued as highly as a degree in politics, you know, in the future?
Well, I don't think you need a degree in politics to run the country or save us from death or be a fantastic journalist. No, we don't, you know, we need a much greater diversity of people entering public life, and including people who don't have degrees. You know, there was a period when I think broadcasters demanded that people had degrees, and I think that's entirely unnecessary. I think where people don't have degrees or backgrounds that have given them information about how to understand or how to science or data, then we've got to give them extra training. You know, just as we give people training in safety before they go into hostile environments, you know, we need to really, at the end of this, look at where the deficits in knowledge were. And maybe politicians and journalists could all go on science and data training courses together.
That would be useful and fun.
Well, mind you, loads of them went to university with each other.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, that really makes people feel shut out. When it turns out that the political journalist, you know, was in the same class as the politician, you know, where does that leave you if you're not one of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the idea of scientists versus journalists and, you know, scientists versus politicians, Sally Ann Wilson makes a point rather than a question, which is South Korea's response to the pandemic is especially noteworthy because one difference is to their approach is that the briefings were held by scientists and not politicians. Now, I remember editing a journalist fellows paper, a South Korean journalist paper who'd written about the MERS crisis, which had been very badly handled in South Korea. And his argument there was almost the opposite of yours, where he said because it was a health crisis, the health reporters led on the coverage of the reporting, which meant they didn't have and the health reporters themselves tended to be doctors who become journalists. So they had the scientific knowledge, but what they didn't have was the appetite or the skills to kind of push back on the politicians.
And that's why you need a partnership.
Yeah.
And actually, some of the science journalists said that they're aware that these heavyweight political editors can sometimes ask the killer question in ways that they can't. I think you need to have both. I mean, ultimately, decisions are made by politicians, so it must be the politicians who are held to account. They can't hide behind scientists and health officials.
Thank you. I mean, do you feel that was, again, I'm just doing the questions as they're related to what you say, but again, these are questions coming, I think, from India. Two government chief advisors seem to be towing the government line rather than presenting independent views. I mean, do you agree?
Well, I think we've seen different things go on in the UK, haven't we? That sometimes you'd have to ask them, but sometimes you felt the three white blokes all agreed with each other, and sometimes you felt two of the white blokes didn't look as happy as the other white bloke. And of course, we've all read that one of the few women who ever appeared, the chief nursing officer, and again, you would have to ask her about it, but we have read in some detail that in a practice, she was insufficiently supportive of the Dominic Cummings, so she wasn't put up at the actual event. And this is something that scientists told me they're in their world, and other experts, they're very conscious of that, and it's why some have stopped appearing on TV, that their judgments are going to be made about who stood up and said what, when, and who gave what advice, and did people go along with things they didn't really agree with, etc.
That's the really dangerous area, I think, where we start attacking the scientists for not being right because of our inability to understand the concept of uncertainty.
Well, I don't think we should attack scientists necessarily, but I mean, some of them were not right. And we need to say that. We can't say, oh, we'll only criticize politicians and we won't criticize scientists. Everybody, that's why I'm saying, look, we're criticizing scientists, we're criticizing politicians, so it's only fair that we have a bit of self-criticism too. That doesn't mean we have to attack and be nasty. We have to make sure we don't make these mistakes in the future.
Absolutely.
Any mistakes made have been made, but we need to have no more mistakes.
Absolutely. I mean, you work for a UK broadcaster, and it's a question from Nadeem Baba saying you quoted a senior editor saying we didn't really believe it until Lombardy, till like the nice middle class people came back from their holidays. Do you think there's a British exceptionalism at play in our media, as some say there has been in the UK's handling of COVID-19 generally, or is that unfair?
Well, one journalist said to me, we're quite parochial. And, the famous joke of, well, I think it was a real headline, wasn't it? Continent cut off, an old headline. I think there was a little bit of a feeling, the one who said the thing about Lombardy said, well, when it was happening in China, that felt a long way away. And I think one of the points that I would make is that on the news, we're always saying, it's a global world, we're the global economy, and yet we didn't quite clock, it is one world. All those times you've said it, it's true. So if there's a virus over there, it could come your way. But, to be fair, there had been other viruses in the Far East that hadn't come as far as Britain. And also some of the mathematical modelers had said that huge numbers of people would die in previous outbreaks of diseases, and it hadn't happened. So maybe to an extent that people, it's so unbelievable that people couldn't believe it. I mean, it hadn't happened for 100 years. So, what we've learned is just because something hasn't happened before, it doesn't mean it won't happen now. I mean, we're all alive now, but one day every single one of us will be dead, and it'll be the first time it ever happened to us. So we can't go, oh, but this has never happened to me before. I've never died before. So we were a little bit like that.
I mean, this is a question related by Eduardo Suarez, our head of comms, who's also stranded in Spain because of the virus. But he says deaths have been hugely reduced in Italy, France and Spain and many other countries, but not so much in the UK. Why do you think the British press is not really emphasising this, especially now that the government is reopening the country?
Well, I don't actually agree. I think that is a point that you will hear a lot. I think in some newspapers now, they are sensing the public's desperation to get back to their lives. So I think it depends on the newspaper actually. But I think on the whole, broadcasters are reporting that.
Okay. I mean, on the public desperation to get back to their lives, one thing that's really struck talking to journalists in the last few weeks is what do you do when COVID-19 is the only news story in town and anything else seems almost trivial next to it, but also we get data that audiences switch off.
Yeah, we had several programs that we were making that we put on hold, not just because we couldn't make them, but because you just thought nobody wants to hear about that. They either want to hear all about COVID or they want to watch escapist television. But I think, of course, what happened was the horrific killing in the US changed that, didn't it? Yeah. Completely.
So it took something of that scale and that severity to cut through. Or do you think there was a moment when?
Yeah, it's very, because so many times this has happened, but there was, something about it which has galvanized everybody. You feel it yourself. There are sometimes there's a moment that breaks everything. Yeah. And it's, journalists have been writing about it, but I find if I walk up and down my street, people want to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, on this call, we have a lot of journalists, a lot of trainee journalists, and if you were going to kind of end our brilliant discussion with not advice necessarily, but a kind of worldview or things to bear in mind as they go forth into their profession, what would it be at this? Because as you said, something broke and we're now trying to rebuild it on so many levels.
Yeah, well, in terms of COVID, I would say don't go along with everyone else. Because there was far too much that you were turning from one story to, one broadcaster to the next, and they were all just saying they're following the science. And I was sitting at home thinking, well, even when I was at school, there were 3 sciences: physics, chemistry, and biology. So is that just the science? And always question everything. I think the politicians didn't question enough, but we didn't question enough.
It was also genuinely hard to question the politicians with these telephone, briefings, and it's kind of it's even harder.
Well, yeah, you had to, and not everybody gets equal amounts of questions. I could have got into that whole issue of who gets invited to ask a question. I thought I would talk about us rather than about politicians today, but anybody looking must think that bloke's on a lot about a couple of people.
I mean, again, my final point, we've got a few minutes, and I'm always struck by what you say about diversity. And you talked about this fact that Midsummer Murders now has more diversity than British public life.
Yeah.
How did we come to this? How did we get here? How's it gone backwards?
Well, although, you see, as the scientists and experts I talked to said, they were all in cupboards, you know, across the UK, and we hardly ever saw them. You know, they might pop up on Newsnight to talk about vaccination occasionally. So we didn't know about this horrific fact that they were all white blokes. And I you know, in the middle of thinking, am I going to die? Is my whole family going to die? It actually took a few days for people to start saying, hang on a minute, all the people almost every day are white men. What is that what British science is like? I mean, it's just, it's astonishing. There are many astonishing things have happened in 3 months. That's definitely one of them. And, you know, people shout, oh my God, look, it's a woman. It's a woman. They've allowed a woman in. Quick, come and look. So, yeah, just terrible. And, you know, university science departments, I mean, the whole science establishment of this country, you know, needs a royal commission. Well, I would suggest they need a royal commission, or they need something really big about what is going on in science and health. And, you know, if BAME people are so much more likely to be ill and to have shorter life expectancy generally, not just in COVID, then we need people from those communities up at the top table making the big decisions about science and health policy.
I mean, yeah, I agree. There's a few people commenting, you know, science isn't full of white middle-aged blokes. There are women, as you said, there are.
Well, there may be women, but we didn't see them.
But you don't see them till it's raised as an issue.
For 3 months.
Yeah.
You know,
I think
they all been locked up
in this time is that there are women, there are people of colour, you know, at these levels. In normal times, if you're putting together a panel or a debate, recently you've been very conscious of this. Are there enough women represented? Are there enough people? And suddenly all that flew out the window. And it's interesting that once you revert, you know, saying we're all panicked because we're ill, and we revert back to a norm, which is something else, till people start shouting again.
It was extraordinary. And we need an investigation into how it happened. And, you know, we let the white blokes do it, you know, run everything. Well, it's for people to decide if that was, if that turned out well.
Dorothy, thank you so much for your incredibly well thought out lecture, and also all the comments, your honesty here. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Right. Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me.
Thanks everybody also for all your questions and for joining. And we will send out kind of more materials on this. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.